Ethan Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, the soft hum of the city below barely registering in his mind. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, casting a golden glow over the sleek, modern furniture. From this height, the city seemed endless, a sprawling testament to his success. At 40, Ethan was the face of innovation in renewable energy. But as he stood there, staring out at the skyline, there was a heaviness in his chest he couldn't quite shake. His assistant, Daniel, entered the room, breaking the silence. "Your schedule for today, Mr. Carter," Daniel said, handing him a tablet. Ethan scanned the list: a board meeting, a lunch with investors, and a public relations event at a downtown homeless shelter. His brow furrowed slightly at the last item. "Do I really need to attend this?" he asked, his tone more resigned than dismissive. Danielle nodded. "It's good optics, especially after last week's article questioning the company's community involvement." Ethan sighed, setting the tablet down. Optics. In his world, appearances were everything, even if they felt hollow. "Fine. Have the car ready." The day unfolded with its usual precision, every moment accounted for. By the time Ethan slid into the back seat of his chauffeured car, his mind was already elsewhere, calculating projections for a new project. He barely noticed the shift in scenery as the polished skyscrapers gave way to worn buildings and narrow alleyways. When they arrived at the shelter, Ethan stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked pavement. The building was unremarkable, its facade weathered but purposeful. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of institutional cleaning supplies and faint desperation. Volunteers bustled about, distributing meals and blankets. Ethan moved through the motions, shaking hands, exchanging polite words, posing for photos. His expression was carefully neutral, neither overly warm nor detached. And then, amidst the muted chaos, he saw her. Sophia. She stood in the corner of the room, cradling a baby in her arms. Her once bright auburn hair was now dulled, tied back in a loose braid. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, a stark contrast to the elegant dresses she used to favor. But it was her eyes, those piercing green eyes, that stopped him cold. Ethan froze, his polished exterior cracking as the implications hit him. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its tiny fist clutched at her sweater, and she held it with the instinctive protectiveness of a mother. His mind raced. Was this her child? And if so, who was the father? Before he could process further, Sophia turned and met his gaze. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a composed indifference. She didn't smile. She didn't approach. She merely nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to the baby. Ethan's feet felt rooted to the floor, his usual confidence replaced by a storm of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Ethan Carter wasn't always the man standing at the top of the world. There was a time when his life wasn't defined by boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, and relentless ambition. There was a time when he was just a man in love. He met Sophia Bennett 8 years ago in a small cafe tucked away in the heart of the city. She was sitting by the window, a notebook open in front of her, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight. Ethan had been there for a quick coffee between meetings, but something about her had stopped him in his tracks. Sophia was a social worker, passionate about helping others and making the world a better place. She had a warmth about her, a quiet strength that drew people in. Ethan, on the other hand, was already on the rise, a young entrepreneur with big dreams and an even bigger drive to succeed. Their connection was instant, electric. Sophia loved Ethan's determination, his vision for the future, and Ethan was captivated by Sophia's compassion, her ability to see beauty in the simplest things. They balanced each other in a way that felt effortless, at least in the beginning. But as Ethan's career took off, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Ethan's days grew longer, consumed by meetings, travel, and the endless demands of building his company. Sophia tried to be supportive, attending events and smiling for the cameras, but it wasn't her world. She thrived in community centers and shelters, not in the glitz and glamour of high society. Their arguments started small, missed dinners, forgotten anniversaries, but they grew sharper over time. "You're never here, Ethan," Sophia had said one night, her voice trembling with frustration. "I feel like I'm competing with your work, and I'm always losing." "I'm doing this for us," Ethan had shot back, his tone defensive. "Do you think it's easy building something like this? I'm trying to secure our future." "Our future?" she had replied, her green eyes flashing with anger. "What future? You're so focused on what's next that you're missing what's right in front of you." The final fight came a year later. It was late, and Ethan had just returned from a week-long business trip. Sophia was waiting for him, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of hurt and determination. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that this is enough. I want a family, Ethan. I want a life with you, not just the scraps of time you have left over after work." Ethan had been too tired, too stubborn to hear her. "You knew who I was when we got married, Sophia. You can't ask me to change now." "I'm not asking you to change," she had said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm asking you to make room for me. For us." But Ethan couldn't or wouldn't see it. The divorce was finalized within weeks. Sophia refused any financial support beyond what was legally required, her pride refusing to let her take more. Ethan had tried to convince himself it was for the best, that they were too different, that their love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them. But as he stood in that shelter, watching Sophia cradle a baby, the memories came rushing back. He remembered the way she used to laugh, her head thrown back in unrestrained joy. He remembered the way she used to look at him, her eyes filled with hope and love. And he remembered the way it all fell apart, the words they couldn't take back, the silence that followed. Ethan had told himself he moved on, that his work was enough to fill the void she left behind. But now, seeing her again, he realized how wrong he had been. The baby in her arms was a stark reminder of everything he had lost and everything he might never have. After the divorce, Sophia Bennett had no time to dwell on heartbreak. Life didn't give her that luxury. She packed up her things, moved out of the apartment she and Ethan had shared, and started over in a modest one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city. At first, she told herself it was for the best. She didn't need Ethan's money or his empire. She was strong, independent, and determined to build a life on her own terms. But the reality of starting over was far harsher than she had anticipated. Sophia took on 2 part-time jobs, one as a receptionist at a small clinic and another as a waitress at a diner. The hours were long, the pay barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but she managed. She always managed. Then, a few months after the divorce, everything changed. She had been feeling off for weeks, exhausted, nauseous, unable to focus. One afternoon during her break at the clinic, she bought a pregnancy test from the pharmacy next door. She took it in the cramped bathroom, her hands trembling as she waited for the result. 2 pink lines. Sophia stared at the test, her mind racing. She sat on the cold tile floor for what felt like hours, waves of emotions crashing over her: fear, disbelief, and, surprisingly, a flicker of joy. The baby was Ethan's, there was no question about that. But telling him? That was a different story. Sophia thought about calling him, about telling him the truth. But every time she picked up the phone, she hesitated. Ethan had made it clear where his priorities lay, and she couldn't bear the thought of him seeing their child as just another obligation. So she made a decision. She would raise the baby on her own. The months that followed were some of the hardest of Sophia's life. She worked until the very last weeks of her pregnancy, saving every penny she could. When Emma was born, Sophia felt an overwhelming sense of love and purpose. Holding her daughter for the first time, she knew she would do whatever it took to give her a good life. But being a single mother was a constant battle. When Emma was 3 months old, Sophia's landlord raised the rent, forcing her to leave the apartment. She spent weeks couch surfing with friends, but eventually she had no choice but to turn to a homeless shelter. The shelter became both a lifeline and a source of shame. Sophia hated the idea of relying on charity, but she had no other options. The staff and volunteers were kind, and the other mothers understood her struggles in a way no one else could. Slowly, she began to find a sense of community there. Sophia learned to stretch every dollar, to find joy in the smallest victories: a warm bottle, a night of uninterrupted sleep, Emma's first smile. She worked odd jobs when she could, leaving Emma in the care of the shelter's daycare program. It wasn't the life she had envisioned. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Sophia would sit by Emma's crib, watching her daughter sleep, and wonder if she had made the right choices. Should she have told Ethan? Would things have been different if she had? But then she would look at Emma's tiny face, so full of innocence and trust, and remind herself why she had chosen this path. She didn't want her daughter to grow up feeling like a burden, like an afterthought in Ethan's world. Sophia had built walls around herself, determined to protect Emma from the pain she had endured. She told herself she didn't need Ethan, but seeing him at the shelter that day had shaken her. The look on his face when he saw her shock, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite place had stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Sophia adjusted Emma in her arms, her heart pounding as she glanced at Ethan from across the room. She could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. She wasn't ready for this. Not yet. Ethan Carter couldn't move. His feet felt glued to the floor, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Sophia, his Sophia, was standing just a few feet away, holding a baby. The world around him seemed to blur. The chatter of volunteers, the clinking of dishes, the hum of activity in the shelter, it all faded into the background. All he could focus on was her. She looked different. Her once bright auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and there were faint shadows under her eyes, signs of exhaustion she couldn't hide. But she was still beautiful, in a way that made his chest ache. And the baby in her arms. Ethan's gaze shifted to the child. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, with soft, chubby cheeks and tiny fingers that clutched at Sophia's sweater. A girl, he realized, noticing the pink blanket wrapped around her. His heart pounded. Was this her child? The thought hit him like a freight train. And if it was she mine? Ethan's mind raced back to the last time he had seen Sophia, over a year ago. Their divorce had been quick, almost clinical, with neither of them fighting for more than what was necessary. He had told himself it was for the best, that they were too different, that their love wasn't enough to overcome their differences. But now, standing here, he felt the weight of all the choices he had made. The long hours, the missed dinners, the arguments that had driven them apart, it all came rushing back, sharper and more painful than ever. He wanted to go to her, to say something, but he didn't know where to start. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry, I didn't know. Is that my child? Before he could decide, Sophia turned and met his gaze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her green eyes, once so full of warmth and love, now held something else. Something guarded, almost distant. Ethan thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She didn't smile. She didn't approach. She simply nodded in acknowledgement, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the baby. Ethan felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took his breath away. He had spent the last year convincing himself that he had moved on, that his work was enough to fill the void she had left behind. But seeing her now, holding a child that might be his, he realized how wrong he had been. The rest of the event passed in a blur. Ethan went through the motions, shaking hands and posing for photos, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he glanced in Sophia's direction, he felt a fresh wave of emotions: shock, guilt, regret, and something he hadn't felt in years. When the event finally ended, Ethan lingered near the entrance, watching as Sophia gathered her things. She was talking to one of the volunteers, her voice soft but firm, her movements efficient despite the baby in her arms. He wanted to approach her, to ask her about the baby, to ask her about her life, but he hesitated. What if she didn't want to talk to him? What if she had moved on, built a life without him? As she turned to leave, Ethan made a decision. "Wait," he called out, his voice breaking the silence. Sophia stopped, her back stiffening slightly. She turned slowly, her expression calm but cautious. He said, her tone neutral. He took a step closer, his hands shoved into his pockets to hide their slight tremble. "Sophia, I didn't expect to see you here." She raised an eyebrow, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "I could say the same about you." He glanced at the baby, who was now dozing peacefully in her arms. "Is she?" He trailed off, unable to finish the question. Sophia's expression hardened. "This is Emma," she said simply, her voice giving nothing away. Ethan swallowed hard. "Sophia..." But she cut him off. "I don't have time for this, Ethan. I have to go." And with that, she turned and walked out the door, leaving him standing there, his heart pounding and his mind racing. Ethan watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He knew he couldn't let this be the end of it. He had to know the truth. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below, but for the first time they brought him no comfort. His mind was consumed by the image of Sophia holding the baby. Was she mine? The question gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He replayed their brief exchange at the shelter over and over, dissecting every word, every look. Sophia had been guarded, distant, but there was something in her tone, in the way she held Emma, that made him believe there was more to the story. By morning, Ethan had made up his mind. He needed answers. He called his assistant, Daniel, and asked him to find out where Sophia was staying. It didn't take long. Daniel was efficient, as always. "She's at the St. Mary's shelter downtown," Daniel said, his tone hesitant. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mr. Carter?" Ethan didn't answer. He was already grabbing his coat. The shelter was quieter when Ethan arrived this time. It was late afternoon, and most of the residents were either out looking for work or resting in their rooms. He spotted Sophia almost immediately. She was sitting at a small table in the corner, feeding Emma a bottle. For a moment, he just watched her. She looked tired, but there was a calmness about her, a quiet strength that made his chest tighten. Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached. "Sophia," he said softly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Please." Sophia hesitated, glancing down at Emma, who was now dozing in her arms. Finally, she nodded toward an empty chair. "Fine, but make it quick." Ethan sat down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. For a moment, he didn't know where to start. "I saw you yesterday," he began, "and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. About you, about her," he gestured toward Emma. Sophia's expression remained calm, but her grip on Emma tightened slightly. "What do you want, Ethan?" "I want to know the truth," he said, his voice firm. Is Emma my daughter?" Sophia's eyes flashed with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite place. She took a deep breath before answering. "Yes," she said simply. The word hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't think you'd care," she said, her tone sharp. "You made it clear where your priorities were, Ethan. Your work, your company, that's all that ever mattered to you. I wasn't going to bring a child into your world just to be ignored." "That's not fair," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't even give me a chance." "A chance?" Sophia's voice cracked, and for the first time her composure faltered. "I gave you so many chances, Ethan. I begged you to make time for us, to see what was right in front of you. And you didn't. You chose your work every single time. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. He had chosen his work over and over again. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I know I messed up, Sophia. I know I hurt you. But I didn't know about Emma. If I had," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I would have been there. I would have done everything I could to support you." Sophia looked at him, her green eyes filled with a mix of pain and disbelief. "Support me? Ethan, this isn't about money. It's about being present. It's about showing up. And I don't know if you're capable of that." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I want to try," he said, his voice breaking. "I want to be there for her, for you. Please, Sophia, let me prove it to you." Sophia looked down at Emma, her expression softening slightly. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Finally, she sighed. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan. Not yet. But if you really want to be part of Emma's life, you're going to have to earn it." Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I will. I promise." Sophia didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him that, for the first time in years, there was a sliver of hope. Ethan left the shelter that day with a heavy heart but a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, his priorities felt clear. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, building an empire, and proving himself to the world, but none of it mattered if he couldn't be there for his daughter. The next morning, Ethan sat in his office, staring at his packed schedule. Meetings, calls, and deadlines filled every hour, but for the first time he didn't feel the usual rush of adrenaline. Instead, he felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction. He picked up the phone and called his assistant, Daniel. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he said firmly. "Cancel them?" Daniel sounded surprised. "But you have—" "Cancel them," Ethan repeated, "and reschedule anything that isn't urgent. I need to take care of something more important." That afternoon, Ethan returned to the shelter. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe for Sophia to slam the door in his face, but he knew he had to start somewhere. When he arrived, he found Sophia in the small playroom sitting on the floor with Emma. The baby was giggling, her tiny hands reaching for a colorful toy in front of her. The sight made Ethan's chest tighten. Sophia looked up when she saw him, her expression wary. "You're back," she said, her tone neutral. "I told you I'd prove it to you," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "I want to help, however I can." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Help? What does that mean, Ethan? Are you here to write a check and call it a day?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "I mean, yes, I want to help financially, but that's not all. I want to be here. For you. For Emma. I want to show you that I can be the father she deserves." Sophia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. If you're serious about this, you can start by spending time with her. But don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you." Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to show up at the shelter regularly. At first it was awkward. He wasn't used to holding a baby, let alone changing diapers or feeding bottles. But he was determined to learn. Sophia watched him carefully, her guard still up, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. He showed up every day, no matter how busy his schedule was. He played with Emma, read to her, and even helped with some of the shelter's chores. One afternoon, as Ethan was rocking Emma to sleep, Sophia approached him. "She likes you," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. Ethan looked down at Emma, who was nestled against his chest, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. "She's amazing," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I can't believe I almost missed this." Sophia's expression softened, but she quickly masked it. "It's not just about showing up for a few weeks, Ethan. This is a lifetime commitment. Are you ready for that?" Ethan met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I am." I know I've made mistakes, Sophia. I know I let you down. But I'm not going to let her down. I promise. Ethan's efforts didn't stop at the shelter. He began to make changes in his own life, delegating more responsibilities at his company and carving out time for what truly mattered. He even proposed funding a renovation for the shelter, inspired by Sophia's dedication to helping others. At first, Sophia was hesitant to accept his help. "I don't want this to be about your guilt," she said one evening as they sat together in the shelter's common room. "It's not," Ethan said firmly. "This is about doing something good, something that matters. You've been helping people here for years, Sophia. Let me help you." Sophia studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay, but this doesn't mean I've forgiven you, not yet." Ethan smiled faintly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Slowly but surely, Ethan began to rebuild the trust he had lost. He wasn't perfect. There were moments when his old habits threatened to resurface, when the demands of his company pulled at him, but he fought to stay present. And as the weeks turned into months, Sophia began to see the changes in him. He wasn't the same man she had divorced. He was still ambitious, still driven, but there was a softness to him now, a humility that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they sat together watching Emma play, Sophia turned to Ethan. "You're different," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. "I had to lose everything to realize what really mattered," he said, "and I don't want to lose it again." Sophia didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him that, for the first time, she was starting to believe him. It had been a few months since Ethan started showing up at the shelter, and while things were far from perfect, there was progress. Sophia still kept her guard up, but she couldn't deny that Ethan was trying. Emma, on the other hand, had warmed up to him completely. She giggled whenever he walked into the room, her tiny arms reaching out for him. But just as things seemed to be settling into a rhythm, life threw them a curveball. It started with a cough. At first, Sophia thought it was nothing, just a little cold. But within a few days, Emma's condition worsened. Her tiny body burned with fever, and her breathing became shallow and labored. Panic set in. Sophia rushed Emma to the nearest hospital, her heart pounding as she held her daughter close. The doctors moved quickly, running tests and hooking Emma up to monitors. Sophia sat by her bedside, her hands trembling as she stroked Emma's hair. Ethan arrived not long after. He had been in a meeting when Sophia called, her voice shaking as she told him what was happening. He didn't hesitate. He left the meeting without a word, his mind racing as he drove to the hospital. When he walked into the room, the sight of Emma hooked up to machines nearly broke him. She looked so small, so fragile, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "The doctors think it's a respiratory infection," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're running more tests to be sure." Ethan sat down beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "She's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. The hours that followed were some of the longest of their lives. They sat together in the sterile hospital room, the beeping of monitors the only sound. Sophia was exhausted, her eyes red from crying, but she refused to leave Emma's side. Ethan stayed too, his usual composure replaced by a raw vulnerability. He held Emma's tiny hand, whispering words of comfort even though she was too young to understand. At one point, Sophia broke the silence. "This is why I didn't tell you," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her, confused. "I didn't want Emma to grow up feeling like she wasn't a priority," Sophia said, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want her to feel like she had to compete with your work, the way I did." Ethan's chest tightened. "Sophia, I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there when you needed me, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophia looked at him, her expression softening. For the first time, she saw the depth of his regret, the sincerity in his words. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly. "I do," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you, to both of you." By the next morning, Emma's fever had started to break. The doctors assured them that she was responding well to treatment and would make a full recovery. The relief was overwhelming. As they sat together in the hospital room, watching Emma sleep peacefully, Sophia turned to Ethan. "You stayed," she said, her voice filled with quiet surprise. "Of course I stayed," Ethan replied, his tone gentle. "She's my daughter, Sophia. And you're still important to me too." Sophia looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan. Not completely. Not yet." "I understand," he said. "But I'm not giving up. I'll keep showing up every day for as long as it takes." Sophia didn't respond, but for the first time she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The weeks following Emma's recovery were a turning point for Ethan and Sophia. Something had shifted between them during those long hours in the hospital. For the first time in years, they weren't just two people with a shared past. They were two parents, united by their love for their daughter. Ethan continued to show up, not just for Emma but for Sophia as well. He didn't push her, didn't demand forgiveness or try to rush things. Instead, he focused on being present, on proving through his actions that he was serious about being part of their lives. Sophia, though still cautious, began to let her guard down just a little. She saw the way Ethan cared for Emma, the way he lit up when she smiled or reached for him. He wasn't the same man she had divorced. There was a softness to him now, a humility that hadn't been there before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan arrived at the shelter with a small bouquet of wildflowers. Sophia raised an eyebrow when she saw him. "What's this?" she asked, her tone teasing but curious. Ethan shrugged, a sheepish smile on his face. "I thought you might like them. They reminded me of you, strong, beautiful, and a little wild." Sophia rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide the faint smile that tugged at her lips. "You're lucky I like wildflowers," she said, taking the bouquet. They sat together on a bench outside the shelter, watching Emma play with a few of the other children. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of peace between them. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a while, his voice quiet but steady. "About what?" Sophia asked, glancing at him. "About the future," he said. "About what it could look like for us, for Emma." Sophia's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of uncertainty. "Ethan?" "I know," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "I know I have a lot to prove, and I'm not asking for anything right now. I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Whatever it takes, I'm here." Sophia looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was trying, really trying, to make things right. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were," she said softly. "Maybe we're not supposed to," Ethan replied. "Maybe we're supposed to build something new, something better." Sophia didn't respond right away. She looked out at Emma, who was laughing as she toddled after a ball, her tiny hands outstretched. "I'm not ready to make any promises," she said finally. "But I'm willing to see where this goes, for Emma's sake." Ethan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's all I'm asking for." Over the next few months, Ethan and Sophia began to find a rhythm. They co-parented Emma, sharing responsibilities and working together to give her the best life possible. Ethan continued to balance his work and personal life, delegating more at his company so he could spend more time with his family. Sophia, in turn, began to trust him more. She saw the effort he was putting in, the way he prioritized Emma, and made time for the little moments that mattered. One evening, as they sat together in the shelter's common room, Ethan turned to Sophia. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What's that?" she asked, sipping her tea. "I want to help you," he said. "Not just with Emma, but with your work. the shelter, the people here, they mean so much to you. I want to support that." Sophia frowned slightly. "Ethan, I don't need your money." "It's not about money," he interrupted. "It's about making a difference. You've been doing this on your own for so long, and I want to be part of it. Let me help." Sophia hesitated, her pride warring with her gratitude. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but only if you're serious about it." "I am," Ethan said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about making up for the past. It's about building a future for all of us." Sophia looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Months turned into a year, and slowly but surely, Ethan, Sophia, and Emma began to build a life together. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past threatened to creep back in. But they faced those challenges together. Ethan kept his promise. He showed up every day, not just for Emma, but for Sophia as well. He became a constant presence in their lives, proving through his actions that he was no longer the man who had let them down. Sophia, in turn, began to let her walls down. She saw the changes in Ethan, the way he prioritized Emma, the way he supported her work at the shelter, the way he listened without trying to fix everything. He wasn't just trying to make amends, he was trying to be better. One evening, as they sat together in the small apartment Sophia had moved into, Emma toddled over to Ethan, her tiny hands clutching a picture book. "Daddy, read," she said, her voice bright and full of trust. Ethan's heart swelled at the word. He picked her up, settling her on his lap as he opened the book. Sophia watched them from the kitchen, a soft smile on her face. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Later that night, as they put Emma to bed, Ethan turned to Sophia. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "For giving me a second chance," he said, "for letting me be part of this." Sophia looked at him, her green eyes filled with emotion. "You earned it," she said simply. As they stood there, watching their daughter sleep, they both knew that this was just the beginning. Their journey wasn't over, but they were ready to face whatever came next, together. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but when it does, it's up to us to make the most of them. Ethan and Sophia's story is a reminder that love, forgiveness, and the willingness to change can create something even stronger than what was lost. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful new beginning. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story on Emma's Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales about love, life, and second chances. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Ethan and Sophia's situation? Share your perspective in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story from Emma's Stories. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful stories with the world. Thank you for being part of our journey.